In this episode, we uncover 6 dumb ways influencer Karens died. From a Karen who picked a fight mid-squat and forgot that 300 pounds of steel doesn't pause for drama, to a Karen blogger who ignored safety tape at a closed mall fountain, turning her viral dream into a permanent nightmare. It was August 12th, 2017. The Oklahoma heat lingered over the Tulsa fairgrounds as thousands packed in for the final night of a 3-day rock festival. By dusk, side entrances were locked and perimeter patrols tightened. Security presence increased quietly along the outer walls. Standing near a restricted viewing lane was Brenda Harlow, 41. She ran a small lifestyle blog centered on upgrades, shortcuts, and getting closer to spaces most people were not allowed into. Her readership was modest but steady. During the week, she worked as a regional sales representative for a cosmetics distributor across Oklahoma and Arkansas. Online, she projected confidence and connections. In person, she had a habit of pushing hard when told no. Traffic to her blog had declined in recent months, and sponsorships slowed. She began treating live events as chances to capture angles other bloggers could not. She even printed imitation badges, believing confidence in appearance could bypass most security barriers. That evening, she arrived with a general admission ticket and a homemade badge clipped to her blouse. At the side stage checkpoint, security scanned it and rejected it immediately, explaining the platform was restricted to credentialed media. Brenda insisted they were mistaken and claimed she had already been cleared to film. She pointed toward the stage and argued her audience expected backstage coverage. When asked to step aside, she leaned past the barrier rope and demanded a supervisor, accusing the guard of preventing her from accessing the platform before finally walking away as nearby attendees watched. The elevated media platform remained restricted, and several signs along the perimeter wall warned visitors not to climb it. The only clear view outside the restricted area came from a 9-foot masonry wall separating the public walkway from an internal production lane. The wall was topped with narrow iron finials, spaced a few inches apart. Dust from heavy foot traffic coated the capstone. 2 security guards rotated through that section at regular intervals. Earlier that night, her phone contained a short clip showing the stage from ground level and her frustration about blocked views. At 9:16 p.m., according to perimeter timestamps, Brenda began climbing the wall, using mortar seams as footholds. A guard approaching from the walkway signaled for her to come down. Instead, she continued upward, pausing briefly near the top before pulling herself onto the capstone. By 9:18 p.m., she had swung one leg over the wall and was balancing between the iron finials when a pyrotechnic cue detonated from the stage, roughly 60 yards away. The blast echoed along the masonry as she turned toward the sound, and while shifting her weight backward, her right foot slid on loose dust covering the capstone, causing her to lose balance and fall. She fell onto the iron finials below. One pointed finial entered her lower abdomen above the right hip and stopped against the pelvic bone. The impact pitched her forward before gravity pulled her free. Witnesses heard a sharp metallic strike before she collapsed onto the concrete walkway, where blood quickly spread through her clothing. A nearby vendor called emergency services while security alerted on-site medics, who reached her within minutes and attempted to control the bleeding. Paramedics arrived at 9:24 p.m. and transported her as resuscitation efforts continued. At the hospital, surgeons determined the iron finial had severed the right iliac artery. Despite transfusions and emergency surgery, she went into cardiac arrest from blood loss and could not be revived. The death was ruled hemorrhagic shock caused by penetrating trauma. In the following months, festival organizers replaced the pointed finials along the wall with rounded caps and increased perimeter patrols to prevent similar incidents. It was March 18, 2016. At a mid-sized gym in Tempe, Arizona, the evening crowd moved between racks as members filmed lifts with phones balanced on benches and bottles. Staff wiped chalk from barbells while workouts continued as usual, until a brief argument over a camera angle turned a loaded barbell into a disaster. After weeks of stalled progress, Tessa Rowe, 35, arrived straight from her shift at a dental office near campus. Her day had been spent answering insurance calls and managing appointment schedules. The gym was where she tried to prove something different about herself. She ran a small fitness page with about 4,000 followers. Her best confirmed squat was 255 pounds, but both her progress and attention online had slowed. That evening, she planned to film a heavier attempt at 275 pounds. The gym floor was crowded, yet she chose a rack beside the water fountain where lighting was brighter. She placed a tripod in the walkway in front of the rack despite earlier reminders from staff about keeping the path clear. She adjusted the camera several times and rechecked the plates to frame the shot. The rack's safety arms were set unusually low, leaving little margin if the bar shifted forward. At 7:42 p.m., she stepped under the bar and unracked the weight. As she descended into the squat, a teenage member walked behind the rack toward the fountain. His movement briefly crossed the edge of her camera frame. Tessa noticed it in the mirror. Instead of focusing on the lift, she rushed the ascent and pushed the bar back toward the rack. The bar struck the J-hooks with a loud metal crack. The right side settled correctly, but the left side landed slightly forward, resting on the lip rather than fully inside the hook. Tessa stepped away from the bar and immediately turned toward the teenager, pointing toward the walkway and complaining that people kept walking through her filming setup. Witnesses later said she focused on the tripod and camera framing rather than the bar behind her. The teenager apologized and stepped aside, but she continued arguing for several seconds about people crossing through the shot. Without checking the bar, she stepped back under it to recenter the bar before attempting the lift. As she lifted it from the rack, the left sleeve slipped off the lip of the hook first, twisting the bar sharply across her shoulders. Instead of dumping the bar backward, a common escape during a failed squat, she stepped forward in an attempt to stabilize it. The tripod stood directly in front of the rack, and witnesses later said she appeared to be trying to avoid dropping the bar onto the camera. As she tried to stabilize the weight, the uneven load rolled toward the base of her neck. Her chin tucked instinctively as the bar drove downward through her flexed cervical spine, and her knees folded beneath her. Witnesses heard the bar scrape and crash as she collapsed onto the safety arms. A member nearby called 911 at 7:44 p.m. Staff reached her within about a minute, removed the plates, and lifted the bar clear before starting CPR. Paramedics arrived about 6 minutes later, but resuscitation efforts were unsuccessful, and she was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later found a fracture dislocation between the second and third cervical vertebrae, with a complete spinal cord tear caused by the bar's downward force. Her death was ruled an accidental blunt force injury during weightlifting. Security footage and her phone recording showed the bar's left side resting improperly in the rack for nearly 20 seconds before she stepped back under it for the second attempt. After the incident, the gym replaced worn J-hooks and tightened rules on tripods and filming equipment near active racks. It was November 2nd, 2014. In Columbus, Ohio, the air was damp and cool after a light afternoon rain. Streetlights reflected off wet pavement along High Street. Evening commuters moved in steady lines as buses stopped and pulled away along the curb. Earlier that evening, Charmaine Bell, 56, boarded a northbound city bus after finishing a small paid workshop at a rented community room. She ran a modest social media page built around filming confrontations in public places. Her videos focused on catching strangers violating rules and pushing them into arguments on camera. The audience was small, but she posted often and treated each clip like proof she was in charge. Before that, she had spent nearly 20 years as an administrative assistant. 2 years earlier, she left the job and poured her energy into the page. Friends said she planned confrontations like meetings, notes on her phone, rehearsed lines, quick searches of local policies. She was taking a prescribed blood thinner after a clot the year before. The bus was crowded with commuters. Near the front, a man in his 20s sat in a clearly marked priority seat, reserved for seniors and riders with disabilities. Charmaine spotted the sign immediately. Passengers later said she raised her phone and started recording before speaking. She stepped into the aisle, pointed at the sign, and held the phone toward his face. Her voice carried, sharp and escalating, as she continued confronting him while recording as he tried to look away. The driver announced the next stop, East North Broadway, while the argument continued. Other riders watched without stepping in. Shortly after 8 p.m., the doors opened. The man stepped onto the wet sidewalk. Charmaine followed, still filming. Outside, he tried to keep walking toward the crosswalk. Charmaine moved in front of him and continued confronting him while filming. Witnesses described her blocking his path and refusing to let the exchange end. When he tried to step around her, she grabbed the strap of his backpack to stop him. The man reacted instinctively. He twisted his shoulder to pull free and stepped away. He did not hit her, but the sudden yank shifted her weight backward. Rainwater had collected along the curb in a shallow strip. A yellow folding caution sign stood nearby, but it covered only part of the slick area. Charmaine wore narrow 3.5-inch spike heels. As she stepped back, her right heel slid sideways on the damp concrete. Her left foot didn't catch. Witnesses later told police she seemed more focused on keeping her phone up than on her footing. She tipped straight backward. The back of her head struck the curb edge. Her phone skidded across the pavement and stopped near the gutter. For a moment, she rolled to her side and pushed herself up, brushing at her coat as if embarrassed. A dark patch began spreading through her hair. She swayed and tried to steady herself. A man at the stop asked if she was all right. She waved him off, took 2 unsteady steps, then her knees buckled. She collapsed again, this time unresponsive. Emergency services were called immediately. Paramedics arrived about 9 minutes later and transported her to the hospital. Scans revealed a skull fracture and a large subdural hematoma. Blood thinners prevented normal clotting, allowing the bleeding to expand rapidly. Surgeons performed emergency surgery, but her condition worsened overnight, and she died the next morning. The coroner ruled the death accidental blunt head trauma. Police determined the man's movement was a reflex after she grabbed his backpack, and no charges were filed. Transit officials later reminded riders that disputes over priority seating should be reported to drivers rather than handled by passengers directly. It was July 9, 2018. The Seine drifted under a pale evening sky as tour boats passed beneath the stone bridges of central Paris. On one vessel's open upper deck, passengers shifted in their seats while a crew member repeated a routine warning. The next bridge had low clearance and everyone needed to remain seated. Near the front rail stood Regina Clark, 60, visiting from Surrey, England. She ran a small retirement lifestyle page aimed mostly at women her age. Travel photos, restaurant reviews, and short posts about staying active after 60. The account produced a modest stream of advertising income that supplemented her pension, and the Paris trip had been planned around a week of scheduled content she intended to post in real time. Before retirement, Regina had spent 3 decades as a regional furniture sales manager. Former colleagues described her as organized and persistent, but also someone who rarely accepted being corrected once she had made up her mind. She had chronic neck stiffness from cervical arthritis and attended physiotherapy twice a month, but she often brushed off medical advice and insisted she refused to slow down for age. The evening river cruise was meant to produce simple photos for her page. The lower deck was enclosed and crowded, so Regina moved to the open upper level for a clearer skyline view. Several bridges along the route passed close enough that passengers were required to remain seated below the height of the metal rail. As the boat approached one of the narrower arches, a deckhand walked down the aisle repeating the same warning he had already given earlier in the trip. Everyone needed to sit or lean down until the boat cleared the bridge. Several passengers later recalled Regina remaining at the rail with her phone raised, angling it toward the approaching arch. When the crew member asked her to sit, witnesses said she waved him off and continued recording, insisting she only needed a quick photo. The deckhand pointed again toward the bridge and repeated that the clearance was low. Instead of sitting, Regina stepped onto a fixed wooden bench, lifting herself higher above the rail to frame the shot. Passengers seated nearby later said she continued speaking loudly, complaining that the crew was overreacting and that she had done similar photos on other trips without problems. As the vessel approached Pont de l'Alma, the captain reduced speed to about 6 knots, normal for that section of the river. Most people on the upper deck leaned forward or lowered their heads as the stone arch filled the frame ahead. Regina remained standing on the bench. Images later recovered from her phone showed she was still taking photos as the boat entered the bridge. The clearance above the bench was too low. Passengers heard an impact as her head struck the underside of the arch, knocking her off balance. She fell backward onto the wooden deck, and her phone slid across the floor toward a drainage seam. A passenger pressed the emergency call button at 8:17 p.m. Crew reached Regina within seconds and found her unresponsive. The captain stopped the boat and contacted river authorities. A river patrol unit arrived about 8 minutes later and transferred her to the quay, where paramedics attempted resuscitation, but she was pronounced dead. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death fatal cervical trauma from the overhead impact. Investigators confirmed the vessel had slowed and that crew warnings had been issued before the bridge. Most passengers were seated. Authorities concluded Regina had stood above the safe clearance level despite instructions. After the incident, the operator installed larger warning signs and additional barriers on the upper deck. It was January 21st, 2013. At a shopping mall in Charlotte, North Carolina, the central fountain sat drained and surrounded by yellow caution tape. Most shoppers ignored it. Inside the basin, a temporary circulation pump rested near the wall, plugged into a nearby outlet while bright orange signs warned that electrical maintenance was underway. Genevieve Moore, 49, stood near the barrier studying the space. She ran a small fashion page from her townhouse in Huntersville and worked part-time at a cosmetics counter inside the mall. Her audience was modest, but she treated every post like a professional shoot, often staging photos in public spaces to make them appear exclusive. Mall management had already warned her twice about filming without permission. Co-workers said she dismissed rules as obstacles to creativity. Earlier that day, she posted a clip of the drained fountain, describing it as a perfect backdrop that management had prevented her from using. By mid-afternoon, she returned with a tripod and tote bag. The fountain had been closed while a technician installed a temporary pump connected to power. Its metal housing sat inside the basin, awaiting a bonding screw that would complete the grounding, though from above it looked like ordinary maintenance equipment. Witnesses said Genevieve paced along the barrier, irritated that the fountain was empty. When a store employee warned the area was closed for electrical work, she insisted she only needed a moment and stepped over the caution tape anyway. Inside the basin, she unfolded the tripod and positioned it toward the skylight overhead. The stone floor was completely dry, which made the space look flat in the camera preview. Several shoppers recalled hearing her complain loudly that the lighting looked dead without water. A janitorial cart stood nearby with a cleaning bucket. Genevieve wheeled it toward a restroom and returned a few minutes later with it partially filled. She began pouring the water across the concrete floor, spreading it outward with the sole of her shoe to create a thin, reflective surface. The water flowed slowly toward the pump housing and collected along the lower edge of the basin. To avoid leaving visible footprints, she removed her shoes and stepped barefoot into the shallow water. Witnesses later said she appeared focused on adjusting the camera angle, repeatedly walking back and forth to check the reflection. At one point, she reached for the stainless steel railing along the edge of the basin to steady herself while repositioning the tripod. Witnesses later said her posture changed suddenly. Her shoulders lifted and her arms locked as she gripped the rail. The tripod tipped onto the wet concrete. There was no flash or loud sound, only the hum of the pump. Within seconds, she collapsed into the shallow water. A kiosk employee ran for help. Security arrived and saw her hand still against the metal railing. One guard used a wooden display board to push her arm away, while another shut off power at a nearby breaker panel. Emergency services were called around 3:20 p.m. Paramedics arrived within minutes and began CPR. She had no pulse and was not breathing. A defibrillator delivered shocks at the scene and during transport, but she was pronounced dead after about 30 minutes of resuscitation. Investigators later found small electrical burns on her palm and heel. The fountain pump had not been properly grounded, and the water layer created a conductive path when she touched the railing. The death was ruled ventricular fibrillation from electric shock. It was May 4, 2015. In El Nido, Palawan, the sea lay flat against the limestone cliffs as tourist boats drifted near the mouth of a coastal cave. From the outside, the water looked clear and shallow. Inside, the passage narrowed quickly, and natural light disappeared within a few feet. Vanessa Cruz, 34, had built a modest online following documenting her dive trips around Southeast Asia. She worked as a sales supervisor for an appliance distributor in Manila and spent most of her vacation days traveling to popular dive sites. Over the previous year, she had posted several videos criticizing what she described as overly restrictive dive rules, often arguing that many restrictions existed only to control tourists rather than protect them. Her experience was limited to recreational open water diving, with 42 logged dives. She had no cave certification or training for overhead environments, where divers cannot ascend directly to the surface in an emergency. That morning, a local guide briefed the group beside the cave, marking a turnaround point along the permanent guideline for recreational divers. Beyond it, the passage narrowed into a restriction used only by trained cave divers, where fine silt on the floor could quickly reduce visibility to near zero. Witnesses later said Vanessa repeatedly questioned the restriction during the briefing, arguing that the opening was clearly visible and insisting the warning sounded unnecessary. The guide explained again that the passage was unsafe without cave training and specialized equipment, but she continued pressing the point before the group entered the water shortly afterward. Divers later reported that Vanessa followed the main guideline at first. Visibility was already reduced to a few feet from sediment stirred up by earlier groups. When the team reached the marked boundary, the guide stopped and signaled that recreational divers should turn back. Instead, Vanessa hovered near a narrow side opening that angled upward through the limestone. Witnesses said she gestured toward the passage and moved closer, lingering near the restriction, even as the guide signaled again for her to stay on the main route. Moments later, she turned into the restriction. The opening narrowed immediately. Her fins contacted the bottom, lifting a dense cloud of silt. Within seconds, visibility dropped to zero. Divers waiting near the junction reported seeing the beam of her dive light disappear into the sediment. Inside the chimney, the passage tightened around her tank and shoulders. When she attempted to reposition, the tank valve struck the limestone behind her, preventing a full turn. Her dive computer, recovered later, recorded a sudden increase in breathing rate shortly after she left the guideline. Her tank gauge showed the air supply dropping rapidly over the next several minutes, consistent with heavy breathing under stress. Divers outside the restriction saw silt pushing from the opening, but could not see inside. The guide signaled her repeatedly with his light, but received no response. After several minutes, he escorted the remaining divers toward the entrance and alerted the boat crew that a diver was missing. Local rescue divers arrived and entered the cave along the primary guideline. With visibility near zero, they searched by touch along the rock walls. About 13 feet from the main guideline, rescuers found Vanessa wedged in a narrow vertical restriction. Her tank gauge showed almost no air. She was brought to the surface roughly 40 minutes after the alarm. CPR began on the boat and continued on shore, but she had no pulse. The coroner ruled she drowned after exhausting her air supply. Investigators found no equipment failure. The final report concluded she had left the guideline and entered the restricted passage without cave training, triggering a silt-out and disorientation that prevented her from finding her way back. In the months that followed, local dive operators reinforced the cave boundary markers and required stricter guide supervision for recreational groups entering the site. Thank you for watching. If you're ready to see more last moments videos, click right here.